the more assumptions that an interpretation has to make, by the very nature of it, the less probable it becomes. You should have interpretations that are as free of controversial assumptions as possible, I think. This is all part of a kind of package deal, contextually in Genesis 1 to 11, this so-called primeval history.
Yeah, I think, and I think also literarily what it's doing is it's not actually trying to give us, a detailed view of the past. It's really functioning, I think, as like an introduction to the Pentateuch, right? And,
yes.
And
That's
then
right.
Really kind of explaining kind of this mess that the world is in, and there's like a lot of strong language that resonates with exile, which was where a lot of this was finally compiled, even though the stories probably existed beforehand.
Yes, I think that's controversial. A lot of scholarship on the interpretation of Genesis is based on giving it a post-exilic date. And if our viewers aren't familiar with that, that would mean that it was after the Jews, or during the time that the Jews were exiled in Babylon.
Like when Daniel was...
Yes, that's right. When Daniel was in Babylon, and this was
before
after
Ezra and Nehemiah come back.
That's right. And I think,
and to be clear, that does not deny Mosaic authorship, because it could be that Moses actually wrote key pieces of it or compiled key pieces of it, and it gets recompiled again in the exile. So
yes, in fact, there are these source critical theories about precisely that sort of composition.
Like John Sailhammer takes an inerrancy view, and Seth Postel is probably what I'd point to. So when we say source critical, we don't mean that in a skeptical, not trusting scripture point of view, though some people could.
No.
So this is consistent with inerrancy, like Greg Beale would also do.
What I want to say, though, is that I think conclusions that are predicated on the assumption of an exilic or post-exilic date for Genesis are tenuous, because although I'm not an Old Testament scholar, from my reading of issues pertinent to the dating of these documents, I am very skeptical that Genesis comes together that recently. I think that it was pre-exilic, and that therefore any interpretations that have to presuppose an exilic or post-exilic date, I think, become more tenuous.
But I mean, can it be both? Can it be like, it's a story that was composed pre-exilic, but then it was retold exilically, and it's just a story that's being retold. And
well, the question would be whether or not you have evidence for the Pentateuch being compiled or Genesis being written during or after the exile. And
so I think the evidence that people point to is strong interactions with ancient Near Eastern literature from the Babylonian myths, and so that's what they point to. Now, maybe they're wrong, and I'm not an expert enough to adjudicate this, but I guess I am a little bit resistant to the either or thinking. I mean, it's very clear that these are being retold stories, and the way how stories are retold is that you kind of are truthfully telling the story from before, but you're also adding in, a spin to it often. And in this case, I would say it's an inspired spin that's engaging with contemporary issues. That's almost how stories are always told. You can even see that today in how movies are told, right? So it'll be like an old book that they're telling and retelling in a movie, but then they'll tell that story now in a way that engages some contemporary issues. So
it just seems to me, based on what I've read, that the linguistic evidence pertinent to Genesis and the Pentateuch suggests that it's not that recent in its compilation. And so it's better to have interpretations that are free of that assumption.
Sure.
The more assumptions that an interpretation has to make, by the very nature of it, the less probable it becomes. You should have interpretations that are as free of controversial assumptions as possible, I think.
Now, part of your concern too is like you're going to a mythological view in some ways, but I don't actually really know if mythological is the right term. You say mytho-historical, right?
Yeah, because I'm defending the historical Adam and Eve.
So I guess one question I have is it a good way to think about it? I mean, you could never really call it this way academically, but almost kind of like a nonfiction graphic novel or comic book.
Oh gosh, that would be even more explosive than calling it mytho.
Well, no, because like like a good friend of mine, John Hendricks, is a renowned illustrator. He wrote a graphic novel, a comic book.
Yes, I understand.
About Henrik Bonhoeffer.
Oh.
It's like he did historical work. It's like a history book, but it's in the genre of a comic book.
Yes.
And that doesn't somehow undermine the reality that Bonhoeffer lived.
No, that's right.
Even though it's true that comic books, from a genre point of view, are all fictional. Well, I mean, except when they're not. So.
Yeah. Yes, you're quite right, I think, in pointing that out.
So is that a good way to explain it, or?
Well, I don't think it's a good way to explain it, because that is just an illustration that might help the layperson, but it's not one that would satisfy the Old Testament scholar who's looking to get a careful, nuanced analysis of the genre of this writing. I mean,
I agree. I think
like saying the book of Revelation is a graphic novel.
Well, yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm more trying to help or think about how how people who are not immersed in that world like me appreciate what I mean, honestly, we've been struggling. It's not just you. At the bar, people have really struggled. It's been really interesting to watch people struggle how to label the genre of Genesis. It seems of Genesis 1 to 11, it seems to sit into a different sort of genre.
Yeah.
Than really they can point to. It's not really ancient Near Eastern myth precisely.
Right. No.
It deviates from that pattern pretty strongly in important ways.
I think
it's not really the rest of Genesis. It's not really the Pentateuch. And so some people even suggested we just need to put it into its own like bookshelf. That's the only thing in that genre.
Yeah. Yes. Well, as you may remember, when we were there the first time, Bill Arnold, who is an Old Testament scholar at Asbury Seminary, spoke. And in his paper, Bill Arnold presented this view of the genre of Genesis 1 to 11 as a mytho-history. And that was the first time I had ever heard this labeled or discussed. And it really lit a fire under me. I mean, you were the scientific fire that was lit beneath me, but Bill Arnold's genre analysis was the biblical or interpretive fire that was lit under me, and that I then began to explore after the conference. And so I owe a lot to Bill Arnold for this genre analysis.